Okay, hello, lovely children. We are going to talk today and do a quick review of the American Indians and Exploration Standard. That is SS8H1. And so let's get started. All right, so with this, um, we're going to talk about European impact. So that means when those explorers from the continent of Europe came across the Atlantic Ocean and made contact with the American Indians in what we now call North America and in Georgia, on our continent and in our current, the area that's our state, when those Europeans came across and made contact with those American Indians, life changed forever for the Europeans and for the American Indians, especially for the American Indians. So we're going to talk about that contact and how it changed the American Indians. Before we get started with that, real quickly, if you'll remember, we did a little bit of background knowledge about what history is, and the Mississippian Indians were prehistoric, meaning that they came before history was recorded for them. No one was writing down their stories. They had traditions like stories passed down over time and things like that. Most scientists and historians believe that these people crossed. Russia and Alaska are actually pretty close to each other, believe it or not. And so they think that they crossed what they call the Bering Strait. It was either frozen or the water had receded down to where they walked on land. Either way, we think that they walked here, and they walked to what we now call North America and what we now call Georgia. And these early people, before they made contact, we talked about all the different cultures, but now we're talking about the Mississippian Indians. And so with the Mississippian Indians, these people, these American Indians, lived in Georgia and around the 1600s when European contact was made. And remember, we talked about their culture, and it was different than European culture. They had a priest chief. They had those flat-topped mounds, those earth mounds called temple mounds, and they buried their dead. They could have them for ceremonies and be inside of them. And the priest chief, or the leader of their people, he could actually stand or have his home on top of that, or sometimes even the elites could. There were elites or higher ranking people, and then there were commoners or lower ranking people. So if you're thinking about like elites, like Kim Kardashian is a higher ranking person than I am. I'm just a commoner. So if that gives you some kind of perspective, or like, Yeezy, elite, Miss Far, common. So that gives you some kind of perspective. They had a culture like that. Now they didn't have, selfies and Kim Kardashian, but they did have a culture where they had elites and people who were high ranking in their culture. All right. And so they, with this, we know about their lives because they left the Indian mounds behind. We have like Okmulgee and Kolomoki and places like that. And we know because some of these people were buried like with their things that they believed in some sort of life after death. So they had some sort of religion. We're just not 100% sure, exactly what they believed. And so Mississippian culture here, their little mounds, and then they had food. Food is delicious, right? So they ate things that were indigenous or local to to Georgia during this time period, and in North America. So that was pumpkins, beans, squash, and then they hunted deer and turkey and rabbits and squirrels, and then they also had corn. So think of Thanksgiving for the most part, except for the mashed potatoes. The mashed potatoes were not there, but pretty much everything else. Think about, Thanksgiving and that first meal that took place and what happened, and some of those things are very similar. They also made tools. They made axes and bows and arrows, and they made, little homes. We'll get to shelter in just a second, but they were able to make all different kinds of tools and weapons. They had the spears and the atlatls and the hooks that they whittled out of bones from different animals. So they were they had a very productive, very effective life. It's just the Mississippian weapons just really didn't compare to the European weapons. And then in terms of their shelter, they had those little thatch houses made of what they call daub, mud and sticks, and their little temple mounds. And then when they came into contact with the Europeans traveled here for what we call the 3 Gs, God, gold, and glory. They were here for fame and fortune and to make a name for themselves and to spread their religion. And so a lot of these European ideals kind of took, are driving these people, obviously, during this time period. They wanted to spread religion, they wanted to find new resources, and they wanted to become famous. So those key things are very similar to actually wants and desires in our own cultures today that we find. But Christopher Columbus, remember, 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. He came over and discovered what they called the New World. Now, and discovered, he didn't really discover it. It had already been found by the American Indians and by the Vikings and other people. However, because he's the first European to discover it, he gets a lot of that credit. He wasn't even really the first European, but he's the first European that came on behalf of a king and queen, and he gets a lot of the credit. So with this, he came over, and then Spain is right here, set up colonies on the Georgia Barrier Islands and in Florida and in Central and South America. And then the British, or the English, came in and established colonies from Georgia to Maine, and then eventually the United States will have a revolution, make its own country, so on and so forth. We're just not there yet. All right. So when the Europeans came into contact with the American Indians, everything changed. And we definitely learn about that through Hernando de Soto. Now, Hernando de Soto was a Spanish conquistador. He was an explorer, and he came to Georgia pretty much for one reason. He's looking for gold. And so with this gold, what he wants to do is become rich and famous. Obviously, he had already had some really successful expeditions, and he really wanted to find gold and add to his fame and to his glory. But when he came into contact with these American Indians, it was really devastating. He came in demanding gold, and when these American Indians didn't have any gold to offer him or didn't really understand what he was wanting, he was very ruthless and very cruel to them. He killed their people. They in turn attacked him and his people. They waged war, and a lot of the American Indians died from these wars. And then stinky, smelly Jeremy de Soto left his nasty germs, and his men, he had a few hundred men, left his germs there, and the American Indians had no immunity, meaning they caught everything. Like if you know somebody who gets sick all the time, because they have no immunity, think about that, kind of like the American Indians. They had just never been exposed to any diseases, and they got very sick, and it wiped out most of their culture. And not only that, but De Soto, as he's making his little journey around, ends up dying near the Mississippi River, having never found gold. So this was like totally an epic fail on De Soto's part. I mean, you don't find gold, you die, you kill most of the Mississippian Indians. That's a pretty epic fail. But we do talk about him because his influence on the Mississippians, I mean, their lives changed forever. And then several years, actually over 20 years after De Soto came in, the Spanish sent missionaries and priests over to the Georgia Barrier Islands in hopes of converting the American Indians left who didn't die from the mass genocide of their people from war and disease, the remaining American Indians, to convert them to Christianity. They are Catholic, and so they wanted to convert them. And so they set up missions on several of the Georgia Barrier Islands. So if you look here, there were several Barrier Islands missions, and so their goal was to convert the people over. A lot of this conversion was really like, hey, you're going to convert and it's going to be awesome. And usually anytime you use that conversion tactic with people in terms of religion, it doesn't work very well. And so it did not work very well in this instance. And so with that, the missions were ultimately not successful. Some of the Native Americans or the American Indians revolted. Some of them were angry. And then eventually, the Barrier Islands missions, the Spanish will move down from the Barrier Islands, and they will move down into St. Augustine, into what they call La Florida. So overall, the Spanish definitely dramatically changed Georgia during this time period. And we see huge differences in their culture. There was a culture collision, there were changes, but ultimately what happens is most of the Mississippians died out, and then their people would never be the same. So after this, after the Spanish move out, eventually what's going to happen is that the English will come in later and establish colonies in Georgia. Will establish the colony of Georgia, and that will be what we talk about in our next unit. So English exploration is next on deck, and hopefully that summarizes the Mississippians and the American Indian cultures, or excuse me, just the culture, and then it also talks. Hopefully, that summarizes Spanish exploration for you too. Hope everyone is ready for your test and ready to make sure that you're doing your best effort on this. So, I will see you again soon. Bye.